Hey, it's Drybear. We are on our way to the final update for Season 1 in the First Descendant on October 10th, but there's still a lot of questions around the game, what needs to be improved, and what we can expect going forward with the launch of Season 2 and beyond. But there have been a ton of interviews with the producer, the director, and some of the various devs at the internal team that handles the First Descendant at Nexon. So today I wanted to summarize everything that's been said over the last 2 to 4 weeks going over the game, because there might be some things that you missed that you may not know is already coming. The first thing to talk about is a summary of the previous presentation that the director gave locally, at least near where the headquarters is located and their development studio, talking about the game and where it's going. And I'll summarize the general idea of this because it's kind of just where their motivations lie. Firstly, they are very happy with the launch of the First Descendant. In fact, it got so popular, not only just in South Korea where the developers are located, but also globally on platforms like Steam and console and everything in between. They're very happy with the overall launch of the game, but internally they're feeling kind of a panic mode because there was a large drop-off from players. You know, they were peaking, at least Steam, upwards of 200,000. You would expect that to be at least double that on console. So their combined CCU for launch was probably in the range of 600,000 to 900,000 CCU across all platforms, which is really great. Like, that is a huge launch that brought a lot of people into the game. But based on the presentation that the director gave, they're saying that they're feeling the pressure because there was a large drop-off in players, and also the feedback on Season 1 is not quite what they wanted. So I think the takeaway here is that they are feeling very pressured and very concerned about the growth of the game, and they really, really want this game to succeed. And I think Nexon is also applying, like, you know, C-suite and, managerial positions at Nexon are applying pressure to this development team internally to make sure this game succeeds. And I think that a lot of the sentiment they've been giving over interviews, over presentations, and all of these interactions that we've had with the leadership at the development studio is that Nexon needs this game to succeed. They are very, very invested in it. It seems like they've been giving out, bonuses and incentives to the developers. They really want the developers not to leave. If you didn't know, there was already issues with, the Dark and Darker devs that exited and created a competing game. They've had something else similarly happen with another game. Developers had exited from their company and their development studios and made a similar game in their own indie environment. And so Nexon really wants to, one, reduce the turnover rate of developers internally and also issues they're running into with MapleStory, but also they really, really need the First Descendant to succeed, which, fair enough, that's just business as usual, but I think it's important to set that as the mindset that we have for the developers here, is that not only do they want the game to succeed, they need it to, which means that they're going to be willing to open up and cross barriers they normally wouldn't, right? They can't really afford to be stingy or stubborn with some things, because if it's bad for the game and they can accurately measure this, then they probably would give up on that sort of idea, and it's something to put in your mind frame as we're going through these interviews. The next thing to take away from this presentation is that they are going to be moving towards more data-driven decision-making and feedback-driven decision-making. I think this is already quite apparent in their live update strategies for the game. A lot of the changes they've made to Season 1, a lot of the hot fixes and schedule changes they've made have been primarily driven by outcries and outrage from players. Now, I hope that this continues in a general sense, but I also hope that they don't fall into the trap of trying to give players exactly what they want, because ultimately I've been on both sides. I've been a developer for a long time. I've been on the consumer side for a long time. I think that there's going to be, obviously you don't want to stick to things that isn't working for the majority of the player base, but we don't really want to be giving players exactly what they want all the time, because eventually that will kill the game, as we've seen with plenty of examples across the history of the game industry. So they mentioned that they are implementing more, they're hiring more staff that are focusing on live service. They're hiring more data analysts to focus on data and probably implementing more data hooks to track player movements, whether people are completing content, how fast they're completing it, what characters they're building, what mods they're building, and tracking all of that from the data in the game, as well as the feedback they're seeing online. And they also did talk a little bit about how they've been struggling over the launch and going into Season 1 to gather and implement feedback from different languages. They were used to launching games that were primarily successful in South Korea, and in this case, the game has gone global, and so now they're struggling to deal with the difference in time zones for updates, and also the feedback coming from players of different cultures, people that want to play certain ways, and how they play games culturally. A PC, internet internet cafe experience versus someone playing at home after work on their Xbox in, the Western world, things like that. And they said they've had a lot of trouble adjusting to that, but they are committed to continuing to improve that process. So that covers the feedback that we got from the presentation that the director did at a local location. It wasn't like a super official thing. He just took time out of his day to go present on the game, and most of it was talking about game development, the studio, investments, and where they're at with KPIs on the project, which is informing. Now let's go through a recent interview for the First Descendants going into Season 1, and this was updated as well to include post-Season 1 changes and direction changes. So we'll talk about like where their minds are at with this one. This one was posted on Inven, which is a massive gamer platform in South Korea, one of the most reliable places to find game information and game updates for a lot of the games in South Korea. And this is going to be more around Season 1, mid-season, and Season 2, and what they're planning to do. The first takeaway is that they are shocked by player progression, that they didn't really expect people to be as efficient or as aggressively, climbing through the game as people have been, which tells me that they probably haven't really worked on MMOs or grind-based games as a whole, because I feel like the being surprised by how quickly people consume this kind of content isn't really indicative of someone who's worked on these kind of games for a long time, because it's always going to be, you can think it's the fastest, you can set your mind to like X speed, and players will always consume it 5 times faster than you can even think possible just by collaborating and creating ideas. If you ever watch a speedrun community figure out how to run a new game that just came out, it's kind of like that. Someone finds a skip, they tell everybody else, everyone implements that in their speed run, and it keeps getting faster and faster and faster. And like the machine that is the community for a game like this is going to keep getting faster and faster and faster. But it kind of is telling at least where their head is at when they say that they are surprised by the progression that players have had. And on a similar note, they did mention that they are not currently concerned around OP builds. So the ultimate Lepic build, the ultimate Glay build, ultimate Bunny build. And I think this is the right direction to take for the game. But they have mentioned that they, rather than trying to build the game around an Ultimate Bunny or build the game around Ultimate Lepic, they said that they want to continually introduce content that brings other characters into the spotlight. Now, it's going to be hard to do that, because I think that personally right now, the game is just like, if everything dies instantly, it's going to be tough for them to manage that and get it done. And also, they can maybe they make content that is like minus 80% electric damage to lower Bunny, or maybe they need like a specific kind of weapon damage, but it's going to be hard because it's so all-encompassing right now. But I think it is encouraging, because I think it is the right mindset to say that they want to create more content that brings other Descendants into the limelight because their tool set is needed, rather than trying to directly address the OP builds that we have right now. Now, from this, they also said that they want to remove or diminish the amount of gimmicks in the game. And I think that this is probably the right way to do it. You'll notice if you are a TFD fan, you've been playing for long enough, it's very obvious that they had a strong affinity towards gimmicks or mechanics or, buttons you have to press while you're playing to accomplish certain things. Now, they mentioned a couple gimmicks in their interview, things like doing payload pushes, and they talked about removing some of the payload segments from dungeons that are around that, as well as standing on objectives, so like standing on a point and waiting for it to be completed. And they also mentioned the ball collecting mechanic on some of the missions, where you have to fly through the air and collect balls, get a certain amount of balls for information, and then go to the next thing. So all of those are included as gimmicks, at least in their mind, and they said that they want to continue to reduce or limit those kind of mechanics going forward, which I would say is a win, because I think I've heard from almost every player that I've talked to, they don't like collecting balls up in the sky with their grappling hook. I don't mind it. I think it's kind of interesting, but as part of a dungeon or an encounter, it's probably not going to be as fun. Then they dive a lot into Void Intercept and issues with the game. There's going to be a lot of issues being addressed in this interview, most of which are good. But let's first talk about Void Intercept battles and the idea that the players have been maximizing burst damage, trying to skip as many mechanics as possible, and what they think is the problem with this. They talk about how ammo supply is clearly a problem, and I feel like they get a little off track here, saying that the reason we have burst metas and one cycling bosses because there's an ammo problem. It doesn't matter what game you're talking about, players will always find the fastest route to the solution, and if they can one cycle or burst through things, they absolutely will. That is just human nature, that is gamer nature, that's not going to change. I don't think it's an ammo problem, but it is good to note that they are kind of aware that ammo is a problem. Now, they've said that they like the current time limit for Void Intercept bosses being 10 minutes. They think that it fits the overall, and it's a nice soft enraged check for you to be able to see if you can complete the boss in time. And then going back to an earlier point, they mentioned that they want to focus on data-driven decision-making for the game, and so it seems like that they are implementing more trackers to see how many people get into Gluttony, when they drop out of Gluttony, are they completing Molten Fortress, and maybe some of this data-driven decision-making has helped them improve Frostwalker. Pyromaniac changes kind of came out of nowhere, and maybe it fits with that design overall. But in this interview, the director mentions that they envisioned the game to be all about changing your Descendant and changing your weapon and changing your build for almost every situation that you run into. You say, okay, we're going to do Molten Fortress. Let me get my Molten Fortress combination preset ready to go. Oh, we're going to do Gluttony. Let me bring out this character with this mod, with these weapons, with these modules, and that's how they envisioned the game to be. But what they recognize, which is true, and I think a fair assessment of the game, is that because of the way the game is set up, with how much XP is required to re-level weapons, put catalysts into Descendants, and change things, that currently it's just so hard for people to invest in and build so many different builds and change their build that it didn't really fit that way. It's not like people who play this game on a casual level, they play it to unwind after work. They're going to be able to have a build for every possible situation. Then they land on a discussion focused on Gluttony, and I think this is something that's worth talking a lot about because this kind of situation is existing in the game, and I just put out a video talking about Gluttony specifically. But the way the director views the current situation with Gluttony is not something that I would personally agree with, but at least gives some insight as to what they're thinking going forward with these kinds of things. He mentions that the reason people are struggling with Gluttony is because people are building glass cannon builds. And in part, this is absolutely true. There are a lot of people that are building, they're finding their favorite build online that can one cycle Executioner, can one cycle Devour. They're taking that exact build and they're bringing it into Gluttony, and they're spending all of their time on the ground looking for coins because they don't have enough survivability. And I think that is one part of the situation for Gluttony specifically, and something that is worth talking about because there are people that are not properly preparing themselves for Gluttony and becoming a bit of a dead weight or kind of a detractor to the fight, and that's part of the conversation. But to be fair to the gamers out there, that is not the entire conversation. If that is his understanding, I think that is a very limited and very narrow viewpoint on Gluttony and the problem with Gluttony overall. Because I've talked to many gamers that go into Gluttony fully stacked out in defense, they still go down or they can't complete the mechanic, and I think that this goes into a further discussion on how they can improve their encounter designs. If Gluttony is meant to be a boss that counters glass cannon builds, right? It seems like that's what they wanted, the vision they had for Gluttony, and it kind of makes sense based on the attributes that he has. He has reduced damage taken from skills. It's better to use a firearm focused build against Gluttony because he takes less damage from skill damage, so that kind of tracks with the very popular Ultimate Lepic build that existed prior to Gluttony coming out, so that kind of makes sense. And he also does a ridiculous amount of damage to targets that don't dodge properly. Even with high defense, high HP, he will still do a large amount of damage to you, and I've seen people go in with full defense builds and still get downed by him. It's true that he does a lot of damage, and it requires you to use your environment, position yourself properly, use line of sight in order to stay alive, which has not been the case for almost any other encounter prior to the release of Gluttony. But I think that there's kind of like a conflicted design direction for Gluttony as a boss right now. Because if this boss is designed to be an encounter that favors more defensive gameplay, more focus on teamwork and preparation and avoiding things, and more focus on mechanics, then obviously this fight needs to not have a severe DPS check involved, because I think that creates a very confused perspective for the encounter overall. As it stands right now, if you cannot 2-cycle Gluttony, it becomes very difficult to finish the fight because the mechanic gets harder and harder the longer into the fight you go. Not only that, but he also has a very high HP value relative to other bosses, and so you need a certain amount of respectable DPS in the group in order to take him down, which to me, he feels like he's more of a pre-made focused fight that you need to bring well-prepared teams in order to have this value and have this fight completed, and I think that goes counter to the idea that they want it to be more of a mechanic-focused encounter and a defense-focused encounter. Because normally, if you want it to be a teamwork-focused encounter, you wouldn't put a harsh DPS check requirement in that same fight. And to be honest, I think the director's response here is a little out of touch, but as to call it, people are going down in Gluttony fight because they don't have proper defensive builds, I think is a little, a little tone deaf, because realistically, even if you have a massive defensive build, if you take the shotgun to the face, you're still going to get one shot and have to deal with that impersonally. And as we saw with the Frostwalker fight, it is much better to provide lots of redundancy and backups in the encounter if you plan for it to be played in a public group setting. It's fine if you're all in an internet cafe playing with your friends and you can coordinate and talk on voice calls, but to make the DPS check, the survival check, and the mechanic check so narrow in passing, it makes it unreasonable for normal players who are just playing the game to progress to be able to complete it in a reasonable time frame, because realistically, in order to do Gluttony, you need people that are doing enough damage, like you need them to be doing minimum like 30 to 40 million throughout the full course of a Gluttony fight for all 4 players, or more for individuals if you have like an Enzo or a Sharon Shred build or a Eugen or something like that to help the group overall. You need them to be doing a lot of damage, but you also need them to not be going down, which means they need to be avoiding attacks. If they get aggro, they need to break line of sight. And on top of that, everyone needs to be actively doing bubbles to avoid the raid wipe mechanic. And I think in general, it puts Gluttony in a weird place. And the reason I'm harping on this is for the next part of this discussion, which is this part of the interview where they say, can you tell us a little bit about Deathstalkers? So after the director went on to say that they think that the reason Gluttony is challenging for people is because a lot of people are building glass cannon and they're not properly building for Gluttony, but Gluttony itself is not an inherent issue in the game overall, and then followed up to say that they think that Deathstalker is going to be the new Gluttony. They want Deathstalker to be about as hard as Gluttony is now, and they seem like they want to continue the trend of creating a very difficult boss fight that is current, that everyone has to struggle to complete, and then when the new hardest boss comes out, they nerf the previous hardest so it's easier to farm. They say that Gluttony is currently the hardest boss, and they plan for Deathstalker to be about as difficult as him, and just before Gluttony, Frostwalker was the hardest boss and hardest to complete. Frostwalker's difficulty was adjusted when Gluttony came out, and we plan to adjust Gluttony's difficulty like Deathstalker does. When Deathstalker gets launched, they're going to nerf Gluttony just like they did Frostwalker. And I think this encourages a lot of people that might not be able to do Gluttony right now, but I think what's going to happen is it's going to create this cycle where most players just don't do the newest boss. Like they just skip the newest content because it's designed to be painful, it's designed to be done in a pre-made, and for people that are just playing solo, which I think is going to be the majority of players playing outside of South Korea, are playing probably solo or with a buddy or family member that they have, they're probably just going to start skipping all the bosses. And this goes into the discussion I had earlier where Gluttony is just being avoided by most of the player base because they just can't be bothered to do it in a public group setting where they randomly matchmake and that just doesn't go well. If their plan is to do this regularly, I feel like this is not going to be a good experience for the players moving forward. But they did say that they want it to be more feedback driven, so hopefully with Deathstalker, they get some feedback on this process and start improving it in the future. Another part of the interview goes around the unwanted or useless drops in the game, and this is a big problem that the game is currently facing, in that you will farm a Descendant, complete the Descendant, cook the Descendant, and you have it available, but you still get drops for it, which means that you can open an amorphous material and get something that literally has no value to you as an account, unless you were to just delete the Descendant and recraft it over and over, which no one's going to do. Which it never feels good in a grinding game to get a drop that has zero value. You want every drop to have some value or some conversion into value to make it useful overall. And they kind of reconfirmed that the vendor is coming. We know this is coming on October 10th. They've already covered it. And they also mentioned that they want this to be blueprint focused, so that you would be able to sell or disassemble blueprints you don't need at the vendor, and then be able to buy or acquire blueprints that you might need from the vendor. We don't know if there's going to be anything new coming along, but the interview does reiterate that this is in the works. It's coming on October 10th, so we'll just have to wait to see what the final implementation shows. And someone needs to give the interviewer on Invin a raise or some kind of bonus, because they nailed it. All of their questions were very pointed and very awesome. So the next question that was brought up following the Unwanted Drops question was around, what about the difference between Ultimate Descendants and normal Descendants? Right now, it feels pretty horrible to invest in normal Descendants because you're just going to be wasting that progress. It's been a question since beta, and it's been a question in Warframe even there. Anything that's been kind of brought up from that has been a good question all along the way. So the director answers this and gives some insight as to where the development team is thinking. They first say that the normal Descendants, at least from the developer's perspective, was meant to be a trial of sorts of the ultimate. They meant for you to be able to get the normal Descendant, try it out, explore the abilities, and then eventually get the ultimate Descendant where you would invest, which means that the way the game is right now is exactly how they planned it to be, where you would be trepidatious about investing in a normal Descendant and waiting until you get the ultimate version and then dumping all your reserves into that ultimate Descendant. But they acknowledge that this is not exactly how people are enjoying the game, and it feels really bad, especially since you have to spend so much time collecting the resources for these normal Descendants, then you spend a bunch of time crafting them, then you get them, and then you have to kind of hold off on enjoying the game more until you get a harder to drop version of the same exact character, and then you have that character sitting in your Descendant list, which you have to buy Descendant slots for. You dismiss that Descendant and then switch over to the ultimate, then you invest it. But confirmed in this interview, finally we have this. They said that they are still working on the exact method. Keep in mind, this is Korean, Google translated into English, so it's kind of you'll have to look at purpose and meaning here, not the exact words. But they said that the method hasn't decided yet, but what they are planning right now is that there will be some form of applying the progression you have on the normal Descendant to the ultimate Descendant when you unlock the ultimate version. So what the details on that are going to be decided at a future date, but it sounds like their plan is to be able to, graft over any catalysts, activators, or some of that progress from the normal Descendant over to the ultimate Descendant when you do the upgrade, which is what everyone has been asking for all along. Next, they go on to talk about what they're referring to as useless mechanics. So things like, Kingsguard Lance, things like the Final Masterpiece, some weapons that don't get use, and also some characters that have kits or abilities that don't really fit into the current meta. The idea that there are characters and weapons that aren't getting enough use, or they're just not good enough for what's going on, and they directly responded to this topic. The solution for this, which I think is the correct solution going forward for a loot-based game, is that they said they'd like to add new content that focuses on bringing those weapons and those characters to life in very meaningful ways. Not necessarily like trying to make every character and every weapon fit into the generic list of content we have right now, but introducing new challenges, new encounters, new bosses that bring to life characters that may not be in the meta now, that have a very strong impact on those encounters specifically. And they even mentioned things like, out-of-date characters, but also shields, some of the resistances, some of the stats. Maybe they'll introduce new mechanics that really heavily favor shields, and that will encourage people to invest in shield-focused gear and modules to make their shield stronger, because the encounters that are new are requiring that, making you make new builds and new encounters rather than change the base game to fit it for just that cookie cutter combo, which I think is good for the long-term health of the game. They also directly talked about Outposts, which is really cool. So the director mentioned that when the game launched, they had Outposts at 5 minutes, and ultimately what they wanted for the Outposts was for it to be a way to get alternate loot, like it was another loot path, which effectively is what it is right now. You have to infiltrate Outposts using specifically Sharon to get specific loot. But going forward, I'm actually quite happy with the response that the director had on this topic. He said that even with the 1 minute timer, it still feels kind of boring for you to sit around waiting a minute for the Outpost to refresh. They said that they're happy with the drop rate of the amorphous materials. I'm not. I don't know if anyone else is. I actually prefer doing dungeons and bosses now, even though I started the game doing Outposts instead, but it just feels like the drop rate of the Amorphous is not really worth the time spent unless you have to do it. But he mentioned that the 1 minute downtime for the Outpost is kind of boring, and they also might move to the Outpost just being more of a horde mode kind of encounter, and that there's just a steady flow of enemies and you get rewards based on how long you stay there and how long you take out the hordes of enemies that are coming, which is going to be nice. There aren't really any horde modes in the game right now, and I think it will make the Outpost feel better overall, but let me know what you think about that one specifically. Next, they talked about the seasonal mechanics, like more about the seasonal progression that you have. So this is the inversion reinforcement system that's in the game right now. You do either your invasion dungeons or world quests. Some of them are still bugged right now, but it allows you to progress the seasonal buffs. And they said that they are happy with the situation that the inversion reinforcement is in, and that we should expect to have a seasonal inversion reinforcement grid of buffs every single season. So it sounds like they want that kind of borrowed power idea that we see in ARPGs every season. They want a new one coming with every season, so we should expect to have an inversion reinforcement going into season 2. Personally, I think that the system itself is fine. It's not really overly elegant or kind of, super complicated, but I think that if they are going to continue the inversion reinforcement system into season 2, they really need to make sure that those buffs are actually interesting, because right now the buffs started out being basically useless. They buffed all of the buffs and then removed the downsides and penalties with it, and then even now, the buffs are still pretty lame. They just think that the buffs are going to be more related to doing the current seasonal content, as with the seasonal buffs from the inversion reinforcement is focused on making so you can stand on the tiles in the invasion dungeons, being able to fight in certain dungeons with more damage reduction. So it's more about making the puzzles and the seasonal encounters easier rather than in making unique builds. But they do say, confirmed, they would like to see this system is going to be returning in season 2 as it stands. Next, they talked about Haley drop rates, the upcoming Ultimate Freyna drop rate, and how to acquire new Descendants. And the takeaway is that they're generally happy with the direction of Haley's drop. They like the fact that there are multiple ways to get Haley parts, that you need duplicates of Haley's parts, and that there are ways for people to get a slow, steady progression to ultimately getting Haley as a drop. And if you want to play more and do more dungeons, you certainly can in order to unlock Haley even faster. I think in general, they're kind of in a weird spot where they increase the drop rate of Haley parts, and towards the end of the season, people are going to have serious excess of Haley parts, but they do seem like they're happy with the setup of Haley, that if you keep doing a certain activity every single day, like if you log in and do invasions every day, you'll probably get Haley within a month or two, whether you like it or not. It's just going to slowly accumulate, and I think they're happy with that design, and they're pleased with where it's going, and they probably will continue that for new Descendants. The interviewer also asked specifically about Ultimate Freyna and how hard she will be to acquire, and the director responded by saying that they're going to be somewhere in between the new Ultimate Valby and the launch Descendants. So somewhere in between, like Ultimate Glay and Ultimate Valby in difficulty. So probably around like maybe Ultimate Lepic difficulty or somewhere in there, maybe Ultimate Viesa. So they want it to be harder to acquire than Ultimate Valby was, but not quite as hard as maybe Ajax or Glay. And it's worth finishing with the last major bullet point of this interview, in that major reworks are on the way. There's a lot of questions around whether certain weapons or certain characters can fit into the current meta, the burst meta that we're in right now, and the director basically flat out said that you should expect major reworks coming on any of the weapons or characters that don't have a purpose or feel very weak. So they don't want to leave any game content behind, they don't want to leave any character feeling irrelevant or useless, and they focus a lot on the dot-based classes. So they did confirm that they are working on some reworks for Freyna in general. The general idea here is that Freyna does do a lot of damage, Blair does do a lot of damage, but because they're damage over time, and we're in a meta right now that is burst related, Freyna's dot damage doesn't matter, because if there's a bunny nearby, there's nothing to dot up in the first place. Same thing goes for the boss. She tries to dot the boss and Lepic kills it in a second, or Haley blows their face off, and now there's no dot damage to be had. And so they want to focus on reworking that. They will have some full reworks for any damage over time based Descendants coming in either October 10th or hopefully season 2, but it looks like that at least Freyna is going to get some reworks for her dot based gameplay when she launches with Ultimate Freyna on October 10th. And they also talked about reworking some of the ultimate weapons that get no use right now. Hopefully beam rifles, handguns, shotguns, some of the launchers, some of those just really start to come up. I mean, we've been in a meta right now of assault rifle, submachine guns, machine guns, and sniper rifles, but it would be nice to see a meta of other weapons coming into the forefront and aligning with that as well, on top of the reworks for characters that don't fit, and also the new content that may bring some of those characters into higher use because they have a specific purpose that fills with that new content. And that is a summary of what's been talked about. We're going to be getting reworks for characters that are irrelevant. We're going to be seeing new content come out that challenges the current meta rather than trying to constantly make the base game. They even mentioned things like Group Finder or Party Finder, which I think will help with the pug experience quite significantly, where you can find a group that fits what you're looking for. They talked a little bit about Transcendent mods not launching with the characters. They like that Haley didn't launch the Transcendent mods at all, but they might renege on this and change this direction going forward as they rework their plan for the game and focus on feedback as a whole. But let me know what you think about the changes coming for season, October 10th at the end of season 1 and going forward, and what you think about some of their perspectives and their decision making for the game as it moves forward into the future. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.